Alright, welcome back to the Streetcar Shenanigans YouTube channel as we continue with the 6-week preparations on Bob's car. A lot of people have been asking and messaging us, what did the intercooler pick up and how does it sound? So I posted a clip of what it sounded like on Instagram the other day, which was a video, or the audio was actually from like a 300 horsepower single turbo Honda setup, and that was pretty funny. I got a kick out of that. But in this video, we are going to actually show you what it really sounds like and go over some of the improvements or gains rather that we saw from this recent project. All right, so I am sitting on the floor because I want you guys to see what this looks like. Now, this is a little bit unique. So Bob's front end has been modified in the past. It's cut all the way out into the bumper. They actually did a really nice job with this. I think it looks really cool. So let's go over the changes that we made before we jump right into the dyno video with results. The primary objective to what we did with the intercooler and the exhaust was just bigger is better. I contacted Sheer Fab, and he was gracious to kind of go over some intercooler options with me. And we were going to go that route, but by the time I started doing some measuring, I wanted to move like the inlet locations, I wanted to start moving stuff all over the place, and it was just going to turn into more of a project that I think I was capable of doing. So I decided to take it on myself and go in on building my own intercooler for Bob's car. Now what that turned into is bigger is better, and the biggest still ain't enough. So we made the biggest intercooler that we could fit. And you've seen in previous videos or online that this is a 22-inch wide core, a 12-inch tall core, and then it's two 3.5-inch thick cores welded together around the perimeter to give us the intercooler brick in the center. Then we had Flat Out, Sergio from Flat Out help us make the end tanks, kind of custom orientation to move the inlet tubes back. We did 4-inch inlets with Wigan style vibrant clamps, which is their new pinless ones. Those were kind of cool, and basically make that fit. So the mount, we did a sandwich between the bumper support, bumper mount, so that just kind of smashes on and holds the intercooler up in place, which worked out great, and it's very strong. We put extra plates on the end tanks to reinforce it, and it's really, really solid. So I'm happy overall. But I did not expect the results that we got from putting this intercooler and, of course, increasing the exhaust size. So you guys see what we did with the intercooler, 4-inch charge piping off the F1X into the core. I was very mindful on the amount of bends that we did. I tried to keep it as straight as possible. I didn't use any cheater pieces. I didn't use any tight radius. It was all trying to increase the flow characteristics of the piping. And that is 4-inch from start to finish, which was an upgrade. And then the exhaust, which was a divorced true dual 3-inch exhaust to Spintech mufflers, is now a X pipe with 3.5-inch diameter aluminum tubing, obviously coming up into the car and then going out to 3.5 stainless, with a flow-through Harm style aluminum race muffler, or not Harm style, but Harm mufflers. The concept was very simple: more air in, and more air out. However, we did not change blower pulley size at all. We did not change the crank pulley size. We did not change the cam location. We didn't change anything else. Just bigger tubing, an intercooler, bigger exhaust. Let's start with some before footage just so you can kind of see what it sounded like. I think it had like a Harley-esque sound. Now, we have worked on a lot of AC Cobras with true dual exhaust. We've done a couple Corvettes with true dual exhaust, meaning side pipe cars. And we did Eleanor, which was a procharged side exhaust car. So now that that had an X-pipe, it sounded a lot better too.
Oh my God! This has been a good time to pull the chute. Oh my God!
the X was going to be more for sound. I wanted to smooth out the pulses side to side so it didn't sound like 2 4-cylinders as much running. And it definitely accomplished that, and it definitely has a higher pitch like the Tramp got when we went to these mufflers. So overall, very happy with the sound of everything, but most importantly was the performance. So let's get into that. So let's discuss the results. Let's start with just flat out horsepower. Let's just see what it gains. So I have the dyno sheet, I'll put it on the screen, it's just a photo of it. What you're looking at is the before and after of going from the old intercooler system and exhaust system to the new intercooler and exhaust system. And you can see that it picked up everywhere on the curve. I mean, from the minute we stand on it to the minute we lift, it's making more horsepower right off the bat. Extremely impressed with the results. Now, to give you some context, I've talked to a lot of people about this project, and we are a shop that likes to do a lot of research before we make our own decision. We considered the changes, talked to a few of the other guys that help us with these cars, and we were all kind of thinking that we were expecting somewhere between like 50 and 60 horsepower at the tire. We would be like really happy with that. You know, if we could do all this work, pick up 50 at the tire, 60 at the tire, 100 at the flywheel, you know, was kind of what we were kind of targeting, then I would have been like literally over the moon with that. I think that the time and effort was worth it. We would have had better intake air temp control, and it would have been worthwhile on the track to really find a lot of mile an hour that I think we were losing due to intake air temp heat and flow restriction. We ended up gaining 150 horsepower at the back tire by doing these modifications, which is I mean, literally double what any of us would have expected. When we started talking to every time we dyno a project, we're kind of like, all right, what do you think it's going to make? What do you think we're going to gain from this? And nobody guessed that it was going to pick up this kind of horsepower. I mean, there's very little research out there that said that this was going to happen. There's not a whole lot of A-B comparisons. And to be fair, this is still not an A-B comparison because we changed the intercooler system and we changed the exhaust system. So we don't know which one of those were the biggest bottleneck. What I can tell you from previous testing that we've done is that Spintech style muffler has not made huge horsepower on blower applications. We took it off of our tuner Larry's Firebird, put a Borla XR1 in place of it. We also increased the sizing from I think he had a 3.5 single to a 4-inch single and put an XR1 on it with 2.5 on the front off the headers, and that picked up a ton of power. But we knew that the muffler was a restriction. He took the muffler off and ran an open exhaust, and it made a shit ton of horsepower. Then we redid the exhaust system utilizing a flow-through style muffler, and it made the same exact as if he unbolted it at the headers like he did. So once we realized that this had a Spintech muffler, that the exhaust had to go in, past a bunch of baffles, make a U-turn, come back out the same side with a bunch of steel grates that were all rusted up, and you really start looking at how that muffler is constructed. It doesn't make any sense for airflow that you have that on something that needs to move this much air out of it. So going through the flow-through style like we did on this was obviously going to benefit it. So it's hard to say which one did more. In the future, near future, we are going to be doing this same intercooler setup on the Tramp. Now the Tramp already has a 3.5-inch exhaust system with an X, with the same aluminum mufflers. The difference being it has tailpipes rather than side pipes. But that might clue us into which one had more weight on this experiment. Because as soon as we put the F1A94 on the Tramp, honestly, I was a little unimpressed with the performance gains that we had over the D1X. Now the D1X, we spun its balls off, and we were, about 8 to 10,000 RPM over, depending on what RPM we were going through the stripe. And the F1X were just under the max rated impeller speed. And realistically, the 50 horsepower gain wasn't worth the money of switching from the D1X to the F1A94. Now I'm super curious is that if we get rid of the Treadstone intercooler that's on the Tramp, are we going to see similar gains to what Bob did by getting rid of the Procharger intercooler and going to this behemoth intercooler that we built for him? If we do, then I will have to take back what I've said about the F1A94 versus the D1X, and everybody needs to start putting more weight into the flow characteristics of the cold side of these blower combinations. Because really bigger is better and biggest is not enough is what we learned on Bob's. Let's start getting into some of the nitty-gritty details that we've learned so far. Now we haven't been on track with it yet. Obviously Sick Week is 1 week away, or 2 weeks away, but Bob is heading down in 1 week. So we could do some testing and dial in the clutch and get used to the faceplated transmission. But on the dyno, this is the comparison that we did. Now, everything that I'm going to be comparing over the next few minutes of me blabbing is old dyno results versus current dyno results. I'm not going to compare real world IAT temps versus dyno IAT temps now. It just doesn't make sense. Now, in the future, when we're on Sick Week, we're going to be documenting that journey, and I will share with you what is it doing in Florida, what are our IATs looking like down in Florida during a pass, because a dyno pull at this power level is only like 3 seconds long. And when you're on track and you're rowing gears, you're getting that blower speed up to peak or over, 4 different separate times and over the course of 9-10 seconds. Hopefully now 8-9 seconds. So there's a lot more time for heat to be built up. But anyway, let's get into it. So no blower pulley change, did not speed anything up, right? We went from the Procharger 1300 series intercooler, which is a 3.5 in, 3.5 out, vertical core, long tank, which doesn't fit in a Mustang very well in my opinion, but small intercooler brick. On track, that we were seeing about 220 to 240 degrees depending on ambient at the finish line with that setup. Now on the dyno, we did not see nowhere near those type of numbers. That setup on the dyno was usually net around 110 to 118 degrees on all the dyno poles that we had logs for when doing this comparison. Now, the overall IAT is not what we're looking for on the dyno. For this comparison, we're going to look at the delta, the change in temperature versus throughout the dyno pole. So when we're seeing 110 to 118, let's call it like a 115 average, we were starting those poles at 60. So we saw a couple of them that were starting closer to 70, which is what netted us to 118 at the finish, and some of them that started at closer to 60, which netted us closer to a 110 average. So either way, that way we're seeing in the mid 40s, mid 40 degree delta from the start of the pole to when we lift off the throttle. 40 degrees in 3 seconds. Now that's almost fairly accurate if you were to convert that over to the dyno numbers, because if you were to gain 40 degrees every 3 seconds, but then times that by 3, you're going to get 120 degree delta, which is almost exactly what it did. It would start the pole at, let's say, 90 degrees, and it would finish at 210 degrees. It would start the pole at 104 degrees, and it would finish at 230 degrees. So that 40 degrees per second, or 40 degrees per 3 second intervals in this case, actually kind of rings true and converts over to the track data a little bit more than I would have expected. The whole problem with this project and what started the idea of making our own was that there is no industry standard for rating an intercooler. It's the same cores, the same Garrett cores that we used here. You can look at the 3 big intercooler manufacturers out there right now that all make phenomenal products. Beautiful welding, beautiful construction, beautiful everything. However, at the end of the day, it's the same cores between these 3 companies, and all 3 of them are rated at different horsepower capabilities. I did not understand it. So when I was calling all of them and saying, hey, should I just put the biggest one I should? I got a response that I didn't expect, which was, no, you don't need that much for that style blower. We have those size blowers on smaller intercoolers, and they're doing really well. Well, if that's doing well, then why wouldn't a bigger one do better? So we decided to make our own. Anyway, back to the data. Seeing those delta changes at the track is what obviously got us into doing this. So now the new intercooler, we don't have track data once again, but the delta on the dyno, we started the poles at 51 degrees. At the lift, we were at 57 degrees. We saw a 6 degree delta. We're doing the same exact RPM spread, the same pulley numbers, the same engine RPM. We were only seeing a 6 to 8 degree delta on all the poles that we did. Now we did 4. The first pole that we did, that one we only went to 7,600. We only saw a 4 degree delta. So the difference between running it out to like 7,500 to 8,200 was another like almost 4 degrees, depending on what the starting temperature was. Everything is like plus or minus 2 in this situation. Throughout the range of those 4 poles, everything fell within 2 degrees of repeatability, which was pretty impressive actually. So we got that 8 degree delta on the 2 closest back-to-back poles, which was number 3 and number 4. We were just finalizing some fuel table mapping, and we did the poles, I believe, from about 4,000 RPM, from 4,000 RPM to 8,200. And that's when we netted an 8 degree delta, which was the largest of the day. So now with that data and knowing that every 3 seconds, because the poles are still about 3 seconds long, if we were to multiply that by 3, I'm expecting to see roughly 24-ish degrees of intake air temp gain on track if we follow the same mathematic equation that's made up, that we just made up now, for the old intercooler. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that succeeds and how the manifold air temp reacts on track versus on the dyno. But we only lost like just under 1 pound of boost. So I don't actually understand why it lost boost, because the boost is referenced in the intake manifold. The CFM from the blower is not going to change. The CFM from the blower is the same. The piping size, I don't understand, we're not measuring boost in the piping. So even though we increase the size, which in turn should lower velocity, which must be where the manifold air vacuum or where the manifold reference is going to drop, because all the tubing size, so it's going to have a little bit less velocity, although it is the same amount of air. This whole experiment has gotten me to start going into the aerodynamic, fluid dynamic studies and models to figure out the math on, is there a way to rate the intercooler that's actually usable, that's applicable to all of us who are trying to pick what kind of intercoolers we want, rather than just, oh, well, we've made, 2,200 horsepower through this intercooler, so it'll work for 2,200 horsepower, which I think is what Procharger does with their 1,300 horsepower intercooler, which we did. 1,300 horsepower at the flywheel is what it made. However, that intercooler only maintained 230 degrees on track. That's not very useful. This, I'm expecting to see like 120, 130 degree temps if we start in the 85 to 90 range. So it'll be really interesting to see that data, but at the end of the day, the flow characteristics and the temperature capabilities is what's going to keep this thing down, and ultimately is what netted us the 150 wheel horsepower gain, along with being able to get the exhaust out. So going to the boost drop, I think the boost drop, which is, let's call it a pound just for sake of argument, was probably more from the exhaust side than it is from the intercooler side. And the reason I say that is since we're only measuring the data at the intake manifold, I'm not really sure that it's gonna know what's before that to drop boost. Boost is just a measurement of restriction in the plenum. And if we decrease the restriction before the plenum, then how does the plenum restriction drop? Because really restriction is going to be caused by what's after it, right? So I think the boost drop is really just a pretty clear indicator on how much back pressure that this thing was making in that exhaust system. So now going to the bigger exhaust system, the car is making more power on less boost, but it is more efficiently moving that air to the engine, along with cooling that charge better with this intercooler. So that's a long-winded explanation of this segment of Bob's car, which is the intercooler, the sound, the exhaust. We're extremely ecstatic for those horsepower gains. And I think being able to minimize the delta of the temperature on track is going to help us find the mile an hour that more so matches the horsepower that it makes on the dyno, where so in the real world application it didn't quite mile an hour with the horsepower that it made, being that on track it had twice the intake manifold temp that it does now. But a little piece of information about that, being that it's a big stuff 3 car, it actually doesn't automatically reduce timing based on manifold air temperature. So what's going to be interesting is if we see a disproportionate amount of mile an hour gain versus the horsepower that we saw on the dyno, a large portion of that is going to be just based on strictly air temperature alone, since we don't have a timing offset. So it's going to be velocity temperature related more so than, oh, we saw a 2 or 3 degree reduction in timing because of the manifold air temp. Obviously, we're always checking plugs, we're staying on top of that. And to go even deeper into this in regards to back pressure is that having some conversations with some higher level tuners, that sometimes an increase in back pressure allows you to run an increase in timing due to the fact that there's going to be less fresh oxygen charge going into the cylinder by some of that exhaust gases hanging out after the combustion event. We did notice that on our first pull that we made on the dyno, we pulled 4 degrees of timing out of it, and it was still up 70 horsepower right away. And we did not end up putting all of that timing back in to where it found its happy spot. So we almost did see like a 1.5 degree differential from before to now with the less back pressure in the exhaust system, or hypothetically, because we don't have any data. We don't have any sensors in the back pressure on this application. So that is going to conclude part 2 of Bob's Sick Week preparation. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Before Sick Week, we are going to have the website up with the hats and the hoodies, so all you guys who have reached out to ask how to purchase one, since I mentioned in the last video, I don't want to do it privately. I want to have a website to be able to do it all, and it's just about wrapped up. We just finished testing it and the shipping capabilities. So before we go to Sick Week, we will have it live so you guys can purchase some of the Streetcar apparel for this season, which I'm really excited about. We have done some other stuff, but we're going to really touch on that more so in the next video. Like, we got rid of the hood latch and put hood pins on it. We just faceplated the transmission, so I have that all apart. I'll show you guys a quick clip right now. And next is going to be mocking up the bell housing, the next gen or the Defiant Black Magic clutch, making sure the linkage all works, that the clutch is going to be able to achieve the air gap that we're looking for, and also disengage fully which is probably going to require the front of the transmission modifications, clutch fork modifications, and everything like that. But more on those modifications in the next video where we'll talk about the transmission setup. That will probably come out like midweek, so that'll be a little bit early instead of making you guys wait until the weekend. So once again, thank you guys for checking in. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, please hit subscribe, follow along with the 6 week journey on Bob's F1X Pro Charge stick shift car, and we'll see you guys in the next video.